You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Just One Ship, Why Only One? The aliens couldn't believe it. HFY sci-fi short stories. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. They said the sky over Mars glowed for 3 days after the line broke, as if the planet had found a redder red to bleed. The Orion Belt defense was supposed to hold. It was supposed to be science distilled into certainty, a wall of steel and gravity that no empire could fold or fracture. But that was before the Vorn Imperium arrived with their black ships and their glassed moons, and the voice of a commander who spoke like the absence of mercy. It ended with a sound that wasn't sound at all, a silence that listeners swear they still hear between their heartbeats, as if the void remembers the moment it swallowed 300 Terran ships and left only one to drift. On the bridge of that one ship, the TSV Indomitable, the air smelled like scorched insulation and the sterile sweetness of emergency oxygen. Panels flickered as if arguing with themselves about whether to keep the lights on. The crew, what was left of them, moved like people who had discovered that every step was an act of rebellion against gravity and fate. The captain stood at the viewport and saw a reflection that didn't look like him, a gaunt man whose hair had burned at the temples and whose uniform wore more ashes than cloth. Captain Elias Ward looked at the scattered bones of a fleet and thought, not for the first time, of his mother's hands, cracked, dirt-soaked, uncomplaining as she planted beans in scraped earth after the first climate famines. That was how humans learned endurance, long before engines or orbits. In soil. He didn't turn when the door opened. He didn't have to. The footsteps were small, quick, unsteady from blood loss and a leg brace that kept sticking. Lieutenant Jia Zhao, last surviving engineer, had been patching reactors since she was 20. She looked 30 now, though she had only recently turned 26. Oil blackened the crease between her eyebrows where sweat kept carving a new river. She said nothing at first. She just looked at the same field of wreckage and swallowed. "They're signaling again," she said finally, voice barely down from a whisper. The Vorn flagship switched to broadband. "They know we can't filter." Ward nodded. "Put it through." The speaker carried a voice like an iron gate closing. "Terran vessel," it said, each syllable a precise cultural artifact. "You fought well. Your resistance is statistically admirable. It is also concluded. Power down. Execute surrender protocols. Prepare to be boarded. The Vorn Imperium recognizes courage. We will preserve your crew's utility." Zhao's jaw hardened. Ward felt the bridge cool as coolant lines bled into somewhere they shouldn't, a subtle temperature drop that told him life support had found another reason to give up. He cleared his throat. Open return channel. A click, the static hush of distance. "This is Captain Elias Ward," he said, letting the tired settle in his voice like dust. "If you've come for words, here's ours. You don't get Earth. You don't get our dead. You don't get the meaning of us." "Clarify," the alien voice said, nearly curious. Ward smiled faintly, as a man smiles at rain he can't stop and yet refuses to acknowledge. "No," he cut the line. "The crew didn't cheer. People who have seen everything burn don't waste breath on cheering." But their eyes lifted a fraction. Hope in a place where hope had to be breathed like rationed air. Across the ruined field, the Vorn flagship hovered like a mountain without mercy, obsidian and angles, engines throbbing at a pitch that suggested caged thunder. Admiral Karen stood inside its skull, hands clasped, gaze a precise instrument. He had ended more insurrections than he bothered to count. He had never felt quite this particular temperature of unease, the kind that measures not the enemy's strength but the discontinuity between the enemy's logic and your own. Things that fail to behave as expected are dangerous. Humans behaved as if tragedy were a negotiable term. His second, Vurak, let out a hiss, the language taught as a punctuation mark for impatience. They refuse the inevitable, waste them. Karen tilted his head. They do not refuse because they misunderstand. They refuse because they understand more deeply than we do. There is a difference. Admiral, with respect, you've never seen a species who thinks like a storm, Karen murmured. There is shape, but it does not yield to short equations. Their ship is barely functional, and yet, Karen gestured to the hololithic projection. The pattern of their engine cycles implies a final act, something performative. Prepare to record every sensor input. I wish to understand how they end. On the Indomitable, Zhao secured a hydraulic clamp with her knee and breath, and a prayer to a god she didn't acknowledge outside of systems failing. Reactor 3 is arguing with reality, she said. If we route all remaining power to the mass driver, it'll blow the seals, and probably us. Probably is a word, Ward said. It leaves room for better words to happen. We won't get another shot. We won't need one. The ship vibrated in a way the deck plates translated as intimate. Ward laid a hand on the console. The Indomitable had been commissioned the year his daughter learned to walk. He remembered pressing his palm to the plaque and believing in a certain kind of future, difficult but comprehensible. The war had disabused him of comprehensibility. It had not managed to take difficult from him. Difficulty was human oxygen. He looked to the few faces that remained. A medic who had sutured his own arm with his teeth when clamps ran out. A comms officer whose left eye had clouded from radiation and who still tracked signals with the rest of her senses. An ensign who should have been playing pickup gravball on Tuesdays and instead had emptied a rifle into boarding drones until his shoulder dislocated. People, not heroes. People who had chosen to stay. Target the flagship, Ward said. Aim along the fault line where their ventral shield harmonics slipped during their charge cycle. I saw it on pass 2. Zhao blinked. You saw that now. I see it now, he said. Clarity arrives when you stop looking for rescue. He watched the range tick down. The wreckage field resisted their acceleration like a dream that didn't want to let go. The engines howled. The Indomitable clawed its way forward through metal snow. Captain, the medic said softly, permission to record. Ward nodded. The man tilted a small camera toward the captain. The light winked on. Ward drew a breath. To whoever's left to hear this, he said, steady as a planet's spine. We were not built to be beautiful to you. We were not built to be elegant or efficient or predictable. We were built by storms and hunger and the part of a mother's hand that refuses to yield. We are not here to be conquered. We are here to be unfinished. That means we continue. He let the light of exploded comrades reflect in his eyes and held back the ache until the words were done. End recording, he said. Zhao touched the fire key as if it were the shoulder of a sleeping friend. The mass driver accepted agony. It gulped power and vomited light. The bolt knifed through space with the contempt of physics for prayer, and still somehow it carried prayer. It hit. The Vorn flagship's shields buckled, not around the bolt, but inside it, as if the weapon had lured the protective field into complicity and then betrayed it. The bolt didn't so much penetrate as teach the flagship to come apart. It learned beautifully. The midsection flash boiled. Compartments folded like paper into origami that no mind had intended. Light bit into light. The shockwave outran its own surprise. On the Indomitable, warnings became dirges. Zhao saw the reactor's death script in a sweep of numbers too quick to read individually and understood the sentence without needing letters. She smiled, tiny and real. We did it, she said. Ward gripped the rail and didn't try to say anything larger than breath. The ship tore. The bridge fractured. Space welcomed them the way the ocean welcomes salt. And yet for a heartbeat that stretched like a bridge between centuries, the Indomitable remained exactly what it had always been, a place where humans refused not to be. Then the light took it. Silence replaced motion. Debris learned the slow ballet of the dead. On the Vorn command ship that had suddenly become the Vorn flagship by seniority and dumb luck of location, Admiral Karen stared at a hole in space where something that should not have happened had happened. His jaw shifted against muscles that had never before been used for astonishment. Vurak hissed again, but without edge now, only empty. "One ship," Vurak said. "Just one." Karen nodded. He was old enough to recognize moments that didn't fit in lines. "Withdraw," he said. "We can finish them. There is nothing to finish that does not finish us in return." Karen's voice found its steel. "We have encountered a species that treats the equations as suggestions. That is a war of attrition the universe itself may lose. Withdraw." He ordered the recording sealed, the telemetry indexed, his private reflections archived. In those reflections, he said things the council later called treason and wisdom in alternating memos. He said the Terrans are a phase change. Ice met fire and did not become water. It became something else. Earth received fragments of the battle as if the universe had torn a letter into confetti and hurled it at their faces. They decoded what they could through damaged arrays and burned fingers. They learned this. Elias Ward had refused to surrender. The Indomitable had destroyed the invulnerable thing. Then nothing more came, except the echo of the Admiral's final message that reached them like a rescue line thrown across a canyon. People replayed the grain and the static and the stubborn in his voice until the speakers failed, and then they hummed it themselves in the dark. In New Nairobi, a teacher gathered 30 children under a roof built from doors and prayed that bombs forgot addresses. She told them a story about a ship with a name longer than any of theirs, and what names can make you when the world wants you smaller. In Nuke, a fisherman who had never seen the equator tattooed Indomitable across the back of his hands, and then went out into waters that had taught his father grief and brought them home fish. In Quito, a nurse in a hospital with more cracks than beds printed a picture of the Orion Belt and taped it to the ceiling so that the dying could look at something that wasn't a ceiling. The Terran Council convened in a bunker that smelled like old chalk and new plastic. Admiral Risalan, who had once been a junior officer under Ward and now found herself wearing grief like a dress she hadn't chosen, faced the cameras of the world and said, "We are not done." She said it again because repetition turns words into tools. "We are not done." Reconstruction began the way all human rescues begin, with people and hands. They dug. They measured. They argued about beams and bridges and how to bend a city so that it catches wind instead of breaking under it. They replaced satellites with balloons and fiber with copper, with the stubborn boot leather of couriers who ran messages from hill to river until their lungs burned like comets. The first year taught them that victory tastes like hunger and that you have to learn to like the taste. The Vorn didn't return immediately. They had to count. They had to spin the story to themselves so that it didn't unravel the other stories they had used for centuries to hold power together with fear and ceremony. There were whispers in crossroad bars that the Council's Second Fleet had mutinied and executed Karen for cowardice. There were wilder whispers that he had exiled himself to the edges where empires stopped pretending to be clean. The truth, as truths often do, went quiet and nested in a place where nobody asked after it for a while. The second year, a ship fell from Fomalhaut with its lights off and its hull a scar. It carried refugees whose species name had no vowels humans could hear. They learned to write by tracing letters with their tails and laughter. They told a story about the Vorn that tasted exactly like the story humans told. Stories recognize each other across translations. The Council took them in. It made enemies. It made something better. In the third year, a breach in Neptune's arcology swallowed 500,000 under glass. Nobody remembered how the breach started. Everyone remembered how strangers hung from lines tied to their own bodies and refused to let go until the last child's hand found the last raft. The footage traveled and became a doctrine. We do not leave each other. It cost them more lives. It earned them more. By year 5, Earth had a fleet again, if you stretch the definition of fleet until it squeaked. The ships had names like 10 Fingers and Holdfast and Mother Tongue. Their engines were older than the officers, their hulls patchworked from the ghosts of earlier ships, their weapons not the kind that make empires take notes, unless you knew how humans wrote notes. They put a patch on the left shoulder of every uniform, the outline of a ship rising through fire. Under it, 3 words, just one ship. When the Vorn came back, they didn't announce themselves. Tyrannies rarely do when they think they can take something small and quick, like a bite. A soft incursion probe entered the Kuiper baffles and began mapping frequencies that were supposed to feel familiar. It found instead that Terran silence had learned to speak multiple dialects. Minds blinked awake without blinking. A tug named Henrietta that had hauled ice for 20 years found itself in a fight not of its choosing, and won it by dragging the probe into the shadow of a moon nobody had named yet, and letting gravity remember how to introduce strangers to rock. The tug's captain did not tell stories. He died of exposure because he had patched the heater with his coat and wrapped it around the child he had found aboard a lifeboat that somehow belonged to neither the probe nor to any human ship. The child survived. The ship didn't. People added a 10th star to the patch's corner. A small one, to remember a man who liked quiet and taught the patch how to speak it. By year 7, Admiral Solin authorized Operation Choir. The name came from an engineer who thought that if machines could sing, maybe the universe would be kinder. Choir wasn't a weapon. It was a story told simultaneously through 10,000 low-power beacons seeded from Jupiter to the local void. A chorus of Ward's last message interleaved with 1,000 names, an open-handed warning folded into a promise. The message wasn't addressed to the Vorn. It was addressed to anyone listening. We will not chase you. We will not take from you. If you come to take from us, bring enough to fill your graves. On a smuggler's moon called Share, Karen listened to Choir and drank a beverage named for its color and not its flavor. He had resigned his rank with a poem that translated badly. He lived under another name and learned to repair engines that predated his empire. He had seen how an empire looks when it is all bones. It looks like inevitability. He had seen a ship teach inevitability to ask permission. He chose exile as the one honorable thing a man could do when honor was a broken equation. At night, he walked beyond the city's edge and looked up until the stars stopped being lights and started being the cold they are. He wondered if Ward would recognize him if the dead could meet in dreams. He wondered if he deserved the meeting. The Vorn Council debated themselves hoarse over Choir. Half said, "It is propaganda." Half said, "It is a lever." None said, "It is true." The truth, being immune to votes, continued to be true. The next war did not begin with a trumpet. It began with a rumor that a Terran outpost past Barnard's Gate had ceased transmissions. The outpost's name was Shankari. It grew tomatoes. It also listened to gravitational murmurs the way a father listens to the cough of a sleeping child. Its silence felt wrong in the gut. A patrol ship, Little Winter, jumped to check and didn't return either. Then a message arrived on a spectrum that wasn't supposed to carry messages at all, a subtle tilting of the mathematics the outpost used to feel the deep tides. The message translated to, "We are falling." It arrived 3 days after the fall. Time delay is the universe's favorite cruelty. Solin looked at the map for so long that the staff learned to bring her water without asking. "They're testing our quiet," she said finally. "They want to know if we still mean our story." "If we strike back," said a colonel who had once repaired shoes in Houston, "we concede their premise." "If we do nothing," said a scientist whose twin had died sealing a hatch on the Mother Tongue, "we concede our own." Solin didn't speak for a while. She had learned the value of waiting until your words form a shape you recognize as yourself. "We will answer," she said at last, "but we will answer the way we do everything. with the least possible cruelty and the maximum possible memory. The fleet moved like a rumor with engines, not large, not loud, enough. They found Shankari burned to its foundation, and yet not as dead as it wanted to be. People survived under the ground and inside the machines. Humans are very good at living inside things that weren't designed for living. The rescuers introduced themselves with quiet hands and unhurried food. They carried the bodies that would not be rescued with a tenderness that made those still alive remember to keep being. They also found a Vorn detachment, not fleeing, not hiding, simply waiting with the stillness of creatures who think they have already finished the equation and are curious how the remainder will behave. The detachment commander used a translator that reproduced Ward's last message with clinical fidelity and asked, "Do you still believe this?" Solon spoke into a radio that had survived 3 floods and a boyhood. Yes. The detachment nodded as if they had tested something that functioned as predicted. Then they left. No shots fired, no threats, only an absence of pretense. A test. Tests gather. In the Orphean Drift, a Terran convoy of medical ships passed a Vorn cruiser whose guns had seen more use than its engines. Nobody fired. In the lakes of Enceladus, Terran divers mapped a canyon where rumors said Vorn drones dumped chemicals to soften the ice and speed the collapse. The canyon was empty. A week later, a Terran listening station overheard a Vorn debate about whether to apply the Terran method to a revolt on one of their own slave worlds. The Terran method turned out to mean, endure until the oppressor's logic unravels in public. The Terrans smiled and did not smile. And yet, because this is the part of every story where danger returns, danger returned. The Vorn House of Conquest elected a new chair whose name translated to Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow didn't like stories that bent empires into questions. Broken Arrow liked equations that ended with the word total. He reopened the file on Sol and erased 3 lines that caution had written. Do not provoke. Do not predict them. Do not underestimate one ship. The invasion fleets gathered at the edges like wolves that had learned new hunger. Spies smelled it. Traders smelled it. Choir shifted key. Solon walked under the old sky and listened to the wind. It said nothing useful, as wind tends to do. She assembled the council, 300 leaders, 1,000 advisors, 1,000,000 ghosts. She said, "We cannot outnumber them. We can outlast them. There is a difference. We will give them a war that makes them question their appetite. We will be expensive in the currency tyrants can't afford, doubt." Her staff called the defense plan lattice because it turned Earth and its worlds into a weave of threads that didn't stop the knife but made stabbing look like a bad habit. Every colony learned to be its own city and its neighbor's heartbeat. Civilian ships learned to act like warships only long enough to misdirect and move. Warships learned to act like rumors. Rumors learned to act like gravity. They studied their enemies and themselves and drew no conclusions that could be taught in clean lines. Instead, they built a culture so that even if plans died, people who understood the mood of survival would improvise something that looked like a plan from the outside. It is the oldest human algorithm. Do what the moment asks of you and ask the moment back for something kinder. The first wave appeared over the moons of Saturn, not because Saturn mattered strategically, but because it mattered emotionally. People have written poems about Saturn's rings since poetry remembered how to name wonder. Broken Arrow wanted to shatter a poem. The Vorn ships, hard-edged and hungry, formed a line that said mathematics had come to murder myth. The Terran pickets, soft with repaired armor and wrong-colored paint and names of grandmothers stenciled on their sides, fell back one by one, sometimes 2 by 3, in a retreat that felt like a lover backing toward a door with apology in their eyes. The Vorn learned pursuit. They chased. The Terrans left little gifts, minds the size of fingernails that affixed themselves to engine spines and whispered lies until truth became magnetic. Cruiser 9 lost its guidance and decided that hiding in a ring was a good idea. The ring was made of rocks that forgot how to forgive velocity. The cruiser became lessen, and the ring sparkled brighter for an hour. On the third day of the 5th week of the second push, the Vorn targeted the Lagrange shipyards, which were not at a Lagrange point anymore because engineers had moved them twice to confuse the algorithm that predicted obvious targets. The shipyards bore scars like medals and built ships like lullabies turned into steel. Vorn commanders lined up for the kill that would translate cleanly into millions of screens back home. The Terrans let them have their screens and denied them the cleanliness. Out of shadow came a ship that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have made the jump with engines that size, couldn't have fired the guns it seemed to carry. It was ancient the way a story is ancient, not the way a body is. It broadcast a single identifier, TSV Indomitable. The universe gasped. Men cried who had not cried when their homes fell. Children who had learned the shape of heroism by tracing a patch on their parents' sleeves reached for screens with open mouths. The Vorn scanned and found a lie wrapped in a truth wrapped in a dare. It was not Ward's ship. There are ships, and then there are names that ships borrow like lanterns to light their corridors. This was indomitable because it behaved like the word meant. It refused to be dominated by the expectation that one ship could not change a battle. The new Indomitable served as decoy and compass both. Where it went, the Vorn moved to smother. Where the Vorn moved, the lattice flexed. Supply lines bent like reeds and refused to break. Shuttles carried ammo and bread in equal measure because both explode in the right mouths. The shipyards lived. The shipyards learned to build under fire and laugh while they did it. One worker, a woman with oil-streaked cheeks and an empty ring finger, painted the words "just one ship, why only one?" above a bay door and underneath them smaller, because sometimes one is enough to start. Cameras caught it. The galaxy watched a woman paint because the galaxy needed to believe that painting mattered. Broken Arrow was not stupid. He was something worse. He was clever in the way a trap is clever. He stopped chasing the new Indomitable and started asking where it came from, who built it, what it did to morale and myth. He ordered deep strikes not at targets but at sentences. Bomb the phrase, kill the poster, capture the singer. He assigned units to intercept funerals that hurt too well. Tyrants always learn eventually to fight metaphors. When they do, the metaphor has already won. Humans died. So many there is no poetry that can carry the count without collapsing under its own weight. A boy who had practiced violin by playing scales on a table with his fingers led evacuees through a maintenance tube and into an ocean galley, where he cooked soup for 3 days because the cook had been vaporized, and someone had to be soup. A grandmother on Ceres who had never left her rock taught a squad of Marines how to stitch because they were too impatient and their wounds were too messy. She whacked a sergeant's knuckles with a spoon when he tried to rush the knot. A pilot who had flown crop dusters over fields drowned twice by storms that read maps wrong learned to drop flares into a planet's magnetosphere so that Vorn sensors would see ghosts and chase them in circles. A scientist who had lost her twin on the mother tongue found herself in a lab built from parts that didn't belong together, studying a fragment of shield crystal from a Vorn wreck and discovering that if you talked to it, literally spoke frequencies shaped like words, it listened. It sang back. She taught the fleet to speak 3 words in Vorn crystal, and the words were, "Not today, not now." Shields shivered. Beams jumped. Damage maps blurred. Hope behaved like a thing with legs. Karen returned to the center at last, not to command but to advise. The council called him traitor formally and then asked what he thought privately. He said, "Stop." He said, "You are teaching them how to be themselves." He said, "One ship is not a tactic, it is a truth. You cannot outgun a truth. You can only live long enough to understand it or die trying to disprove it. Broken Arrow laughed without humor and said, I will erase their stories. Karen said softly, you cannot erase what is written in how people behave. The war turned. Not at a battle, but at a moment when a Vorn carrier group had pinned a human hospital fleet against a moon that did not love gravity. The hospital fleet had no guns left that mattered. The carriers had more guns than compassion. The carriers opened fire. A dozen human ships whispered 3 words into their crystals. Not today, not now. The beams wavered half an arc second. In that half second lived everything. The hospital fleet slipped along a corridor that did not exist until they needed it, and then closed behind them like gratitude. The Vorn missed killing empty space by a margin that statisticians call embarrassing. The galaxy watched the footage and learned to remove the category of inevitable from its lexicon when speaking of humans. The Vorn fell back to regroup. Retreat looks different when you've held the narrative for centuries. It looks like an empire wearing someone else's shoes. Broken Arrow raged. The House of Conquest found their chairs less comfortable. Karen packed a bag he hadn't unpacked since he left and walked to the edge of a balcony overlooking a city you could not see, because the balcony was on a ship between stars and the city was everything that made a ship a city. He recorded a message. It said, if you wish to survive, you must learn their humility. It is not weakness. It is prediction. They predict that they will lose and keep walking. There is no counter. On Earth, Admiral Salen visited the Indomitable Memorial in the plaza of the rebuilt United Space Command. The sculpture of a ship rising through flame threw a long shadow at sunset. She stood in that shadow and thought of Ward, who had taught her the difference between bravery and insistence. She spoke aloud, though nobody would report it. We are not better than them, she said to the air. We are only more stubborn. Let that be enough. A child approached with a crumpled paper star. He looked at her medals and not at her face. Is it true, he asked, that we won't go to their worlds to burn them? Yes, she said, we won't. Even if they come back, especially if they come back. He seemed disappointed for a second, and then he smiled like a person who has found a secret better than candy. Okay, he said and ran off. News arrived on a wind made of photons. The House of Conquest had fallen, not to Terran guns, but to rumor and embarrassment and too much money spent on funerals the public didn't understand. Empires can survive defeats. They cannot survive bad math performed in front of taxpayers with knives. A new council formed, built around an idea that had never found room before. We can be strong without being cruel. A delegation came to Saul. They came carefully, without pride the way a pilgrim walks into water. They asked for a meeting with Admiral Salen and with whomever could speak for a man who had turned to light over Mars. The meeting happened in a hall that had once been a bank and was now a room where people tried to use language to do things better than money had done. The Vorn wore robes that looked like metal and moved like cloth. The humans wore uniforms, some whole, some patched. Karen entered last, not because he desired entrance, but because the delegation had insisted and he had refused until refusing became the wrong story to tell. Salen opened with no anthem. You are here, she said, to say something we can receive. We are here to hear something we can hold. Pick your words with care. The Vorn chief envoy, whose name translated to balance carried in both hands, spoke. We have lost, they said. You have retreated, Salen corrected. We have learned. The envoy's eyes softened. Like you, perhaps we can be unfinished. Salen let the silence stretch as a favor to gravity. What do you ask? Time, the envoy said. Patience. A chance to reform without your ships in our sky. An entire species breathed in while watching the feed. Salen looked down at her hands. They were older than she'd planned. She thought of tomatoes growing under a false sun. She thought of the Henrietta's captain wrapping his coat around a child. She thought of Ward's last frame of video before light took him. She nodded once. We will not invade, she said. We will not dictate. We will help where asked. We will stop where we are not. We will remember those you took, not to hate you, but to love them. We will carry that memory forward like a blade that cuts only ropes. The envoy bowed, a complex geometry of acceptance. And we, they said, will remove the word conquer from the school books and replace it with the word endure. You may keep the word conquer, Solon said softly, as a warning. The hall exhaled. After the delegation left, night fell on the city like gratitude. People poured into parks, into kitchens, into the small spaces where victory hides like a small god. A man threw his cane away and danced badly. A woman wrote a letter to her sister who had died 10 years earlier and then burned it and then cried exactly enough. In an alley, a teenage graffiti artist painted a ship on brick and underneath wrote, "Just one ship, why only one?" Then smaller, because a story needs a beginning. High above, a satellite repaired with parts taken from 3 other satellites and a toaster. The toaster had died heroically, turned its camera toward the Orion Belt. Wreckage still drifted there, stubborn as the grief that tethers us to the thing we lost. Among the debris, a panel rotated until the light fell across it at just the right angle. You could read the inscription if you squinted and if the broadcast was clean. You could read it even if it wasn't, because once you know the words, your mind will fill them in like a friend completing your sentence. It said, "We were here." In a small apartment in Makoko that swayed when the water laughed too hard, a mother told her daughter the story of Elias Ward and Jia Zhao, and the day the Indomitable showed the galaxy how to define a word with a ship. The daughter listened with the seriousness of children who plan to outlive their parents' wars. She asked, "Will I have to fight?" The mother looked at her and saw the face of the child wrapped in a dead captain's coat on the Henrietta. She saw the faces of children she had carried from a fire when the fire thought it had already won. She answered carefully, "You will have to live. That is the hardest thing. Sometimes living looks like fighting. Mostly it looks like bending and not breaking." The girl nodded like a captain who has just learned a route she will never plot on a map. Years later, when that girl wore a uniform that had new patches and old meaning, she stood watch on the bridge of a ship that had a little room near engineering where a small shrine held 3 carvings. A ship, a spoon, a paper star. She traced the ship's edge with a finger and whispered, "Not today." The ship hummed back. Shields sang a chord you could call hope if you liked metaphors that taste like metal. She smiled into the slow dawn of a planet that had survived something intending to end it. Far away, in a market built under a canopy of sails that had never seen sea, Karen bought a piece of fruit and ate it slowly, as if his tongue could learn penance. A child pointed at his scars and asked if he had been in a battle. He nodded. "I lost," he said. "Did it hurt?" the child asked. "Yes," he said, "and it taught me to be better than I was." "Did you say sorry?" the child asked, because children are the galaxy's most relentless interrogators. "I am saying it still," Karen answered, and bought the child a second fruit and walked away under a sky that had improbably chosen blue that day. The galaxy did not become kind overnight. It became possible. That is the only change that lasts. Empires still tried to be empires. Corporations still tried to call theft a service. Gravity still tried to pull stories down. But whenever something larger than a person tried to assert itself as the only future available, somewhere a human raised a hand and said, politely or not, "We are not finished." The hand did not always carry a gun. Often it carried a book, or a wrench, or a bowl of soup, or another hand. In time, scholars wrote papers with long titles about how the Battle of Mars marked a hinge in interstellar civilization. That was fine. History needs hinges. But if you asked the people who had been there, they told you something simpler. They said, "We saw one ship decide that surrender was a word nobody had taught it. We saw one ship pull a thread that unraveled a tapestry that had covered the galaxy for too long. We saw one ship become a story, and then the story became a way of living. We copied it until the copying was us." Once a year on the anniversary, the fleet dimmed its lights for 30 seconds, not out of mourning but to make space for memory to see itself. On bridges and in bunk rooms, in kitchens and on porches, people whispered the names they had kept in their pockets like talismans. They placed those names on the table of the world and said, "Eat with us." The dead did. Then the lights came back and work resumed, because work is how humans pray. If you had stood on a hillside in the rebuilt Sierra on one of those nights, you might have seen a line of children carrying lanterns, each lantern a small sun, each child humming choir on a frequency that had nothing to do with radios. You might have seen Admiral Solon seated on a rock, feet bare, uniform abandoned for a sweater someone's uncle had knit on a station between seas. You might have seen her eyes close as the humming passed through and around her, a river content with stones. She would have opened them and smiled at you as if you had told a joke only the two of you understood. She would have said, "We won, you know, not the war, the future." You might have believed her. It would have been easy, there under a sky that had forgiven itself and was learning new stars by name. And somewhere, far at the edge, drifting perhaps still in the Orion Belt where the ghosts keep careful watch, a shard of hull turned again so that light could touch it, and the inscription softly flashed for whoever needed to be the next to learn. It said, "We were here." And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.